Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Ricketts, and I'm here to introduce and welcome Clay Shirky, who is visiting us as part of the Microsoft Research Visiting Speaker Series. He's asked me to cut the entire paragraph of the introduction, so it'll be short. But he does teach an interactive telecommunications program at NYU. He's the author of many books, including Here Comes Everybody, The Power of Organizing Without Organizations. And his writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Harvard Business Review, and Wired. Please join me in welcoming Clay to Microsoft to discuss cognitive surplus, creativity, and generosity in a connected age.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Thank you very much. Thank you all. It's a great pleasure to be here. So, as Kim said, this book has just come out. Came out last Thursday. There's copies in the back. Exit through the gift shop. And I want to talk about the themes of the book, but rather than talk about them in the abstract, I'm just going to start with a story that I think illustrates the idea of cognitive surplus. And the story is from January of last year, January of 2009. And in that month, in Mangalore, India, a Hindu fundamentalist group named Sri Ram Sini went out and attacked women in bars. They would drag women from the bars, slapping them, kicking them. And as is by now usual, the whole thing was documented on camera phones, images, video taken and uploaded to Flickr and YouTube. And shortly after these images started to get wide circulation, Sri Ram Sini came out and said, "We attacked those women because they're not living up to our vision of Hindu womanhood. They're not being sufficiently chaste, they're not being sufficiently private, and our next attack is going to be on Valentine's Day. If we catch you out of doors, if you're a woman and we catch you out of doors with a male who is not your blood relative, we will attack you again." So this puts the women of Mangalore in a classic collective action problem, right? They can stay home and not get attacked, but then capitulate to Sri Ram Sini's demands. Or they can think there might be safety in numbers and decide perhaps they should turn out en masse, but they don't know what decisions other women are making facing the same decision in private. So either way, it's a hard problem. There was, however, by January of 2009, a third option. And it was the option taken up by, now I've gone. Yeah, well, I'll start there. There was, in January of 2009, a third option, which was taken up by a woman named Nisha Susan. And Susan, who's a journalist in Mangalore, created a Facebook group, my favorite Facebook group, the Association of Loose, Forward, and Pub-Going Women. And the Association of Loose, Forward, and Pub-Going Women proved quite popular. Thousands of people poured in and joined early on. And their first action was what they called the Pink Chadi campaign, which was to mail pink underwear to Pramod Mutalik, who was the head of Sri Ram Sini, the leader of the Hindu fundamentalist group. They used to say of Sri Ram Sini, they would call them diaper wearers because they favored khaki shorts. And so they decided they were going to upgrade their underwear, and they mailed them pink panties. And this campaign generated a lot of publicity. Right? It had essentially three effects. The first, of course, was to embarrass Sri Ram Sini, who in outrage said this was not an appropriate action. They were going to mail those women garments that would cover them well enough, although they never actually did that. The second group was, of course, the women themselves, who saw that they could then take on collective action problems collectively. And the third group that it affected was the Indian government, both the Mangalore government and the Indian government as a whole, who saw an organized group of people who voted and cared about an issue. And they intervened. They arrested Mutalik for the attacks, as well as some of the other members of Sri Ram Sini who had participated, and they arrested them on February 13th, thus interdicting any possibility of a Valentine's Day attack. And again, this year, 2010, there were no attacks on Valentine's Day. So by solving the collective action problem collectively, Nisha Susan found a way to take the cumulative participatory ability of an otherwise dispersed group and turn it into something useful. And that thing that she's relying on, the ability to do this, is what I'm calling cognitive surplus. Cognitive surplus has two parts, right? The first part is the free time and talents of the developed world, right? We have over 1 trillion hours a year cumulatively to give over to any activity we like. Now, we've had that for a long time. Free time in the developed world has been growing extraordinarily since the end of the Second World War, with rising educational attainment, rising lifespan, and rising population. But in the 20th century, we didn't get things like the association of loose forward and pub-going women. Instead, we mostly watched TV. It became the #1 use of free time worldwide. So the second half of cognitive surplus, the thing that makes it a surplus and not just a series of individual bits of free time, is a media landscape that allows us to take that distributed free time and treat it in aggregate. Without needing an organization in advance, without needing management structure in advance, we can get people to combine forces and create new kinds of value that weren't possible out of this surplus. We're seeing this pattern show up over and over again. And very often, an initial response to a crisis will bring about something that actually turns out to have long-term value. Another example, this from a little bit earlier, at the end of 2007, there was a disputed presidential election in Kenya. And in the aftermath of that election, there was an outbreak of ethnic violence. And in response to that, Oriokola, a lawyer living in Nairobi who blogs at Kenyan Pundit, started covering the ethnic violence, started writing about the violence on her blog. And shortly after she started writing about it, a media blackout was imposed. The Kenyan government shut down media reporting on the ethnic violence, and in particular, forbade any live reporting of any sort, no live audio, no live video. Right? So suddenly, Akola's blog had gone from being commentary on the events after the election to being one of the only outlets that people could go to. And she started taking in reports from her commenters about where the violence was. And she became so important that she couldn't keep up. And she said, essentially, I could do this 24 hours a day and still not keep up if only there was a way to automate this. Two programmers held their hands up. They said, we could build that. And 72 hours later, Ushahidi launched. And Ushahidi, the name means witness or testimony in Swahili, is simply a way of taking reports from the field, whether over the web or critically SMS, and placing them on a map. Right? And that was enough to take the cumulative knowledge of the participants and turn it into something aggregatable and publicly available. She took what society already knew, which is where the violence was, and instead of having that information be distributed and not visible, Ushahidi turned into a platform for crisis mapping. That intuition, invented for the aftermath of the Kenyan election, worked so well that the programmers who worked on it said, we're going to turn this into a platform. Right? And so they launched Ushahidi.com. It's since been used to track election fraud in Mexico. It's been used to track snow cleanup in Washington, first world problems. It's been used most famously to track the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti. Right? And if you go and look on the front page of Ushahidi, you will see now that it is used all over the world. Right? From its East African origins, it has gone worldwide in less than 3 years. Right? So, what Oriokola did would not have been possible without digital technology. What Oriokola did would not have been possible without human generosity. And the thing that's interesting me is the places where both of those truths matter, where those two things overlap. Because it is there that we can take this surplus of free time and channel it into something that isn't just about sharing with family and friends, which we're used to. It's actually about sharing on a global scale, as things like Ushahidi now make possible. So harnessing this cognitive surplus, right, we're starting to see a really incredible spread of examples of scientific, literary, artistic, political creativity of the highest order. We're also seeing, right, a Seattle favorite, lots and lots of lolcats, right? Cute pictures of cats made cuter with the addition of cute captions. And this is as surely an output of the cognitive surplus as Ushahidi is. Both of these things are happening at the same time, right? Now, it's tempting to want Ushahidi without the lolcats, right? To want the great stuff without the throwaway stuff. But media revolutions don't work that way. Even the sacred printing press, right? Even with the sacred printing press, we got erotic novels 150 years before we got scientific journals. So when you open the experimental range, you get all of this stuff going on at the same time. But here's the thing about lolcats. Even if we stipulate, as the lawyers say, that lolcats are the stupidest possible creative act, right? There are other candidates, but I think lolcats will do as a general case. Even if we stipulate that lolcats are the stupidest possible creative act, they're still a creative act. Right? There is certainly a spectrum from mediocrity to excellence, but it's a spectrum. Right? People can do things, and when they work on them, they can get better at them. The gap is between doing nothing and doing something. Right? And someone who's made even a lolcat and uploaded it has already crossed that gap. Right? The great surprise of the media landscape, in the difference of the media landscape of the 20th and 21st century, is that in the 20th century, we had media that was very, very good at production, and we got, as a result, very, very good at consumption. Right? When you look at Wikipedia, say, Wikipedia took cumulatively 100 million hours, roughly, of effort to create, which seems like a big number until you measure it against television. Right? When you look at television, Americans watch 200 billion hours of television every year. So Wikipedia is actually a tiny fraction of that time. That was the media landscape of the 20th century. Lots and lots of consumption. There was so much consumption, so widely spread, that we actually told ourselves a story that that's what human beings were like. We said that we're basically couch potatoes. We like to do nothing better than to sit on the couch and surf these channels. And even if we were given other opportunities, those are still the choices we'd make. Right? And then a medium comes along that allows people not just to consume, but also to produce and to share. And lo and behold, everybody jumps in and starts experimenting. Right? And so it is that shift in the media landscape, from a landscape which is mainly about consumption to a landscape that balances consumption, production, and sharing, that I think is the big shift. We still like to consume. We'll always like to consume. Sitting down and watching something either funny or enlightening or what have you is quite interesting. But it's no longer the only activity that's now possible with public media. So when you look at stuff like this, right, it's easy to think, okay, I get it. All of this stuff is down at the lolcats end of the spectrum is, to a first approximation, throwaway culture. It's not that different from the throwaway culture of the 20th century. It just happens to be done by amateurs now. But even that story doesn't explain as much as it used to. Another story from 2008, from the same year as Ushahidi. In May of that year, government of Lee Myung-bak, the president of South Korea, and the government of then President George Bush, negotiated the reopening of the Korean market to American beef. It had been shut down because of the mad cow contamination of American beef. Korea had stopped importing American beef in 2003. In 2008, they reopened the market, and a protest started saying, this is basically both on health grounds and nationalist grounds, this is not a good idea. Right? So kids were turning out in the park, in Cheong Park, which is a big verdant swath that runs through the middle of Seoul, right by the government, not coincidentally. And they turned out by the thousands, and then the tens of thousands, and then the hundreds of thousands. And they stayed and stayed and stayed. They stayed all night and day for days, then weeks. It was called the Candlelight Protest. This is what it looked like from the air by the time it was done. You can't see that so clearly, but it covered the park. They were there so long the grass died. And this shook the Korean government. Lee Myung-bak had to go on television, apologize to the protesters. He fired his entire cabinet. Right? And the remarkable thing about this protest, in addition to its ability to reshape aspects of the Korean government, is that it had been kicked off and largely sponsored by teenage girls, many of whom were too young to vote. Now, Korea has a long protest culture since 1987, since the protest that brought democracy back. But those protests had never been driven by teenage girls before. So what had changed? Mimi Ito, who's down at USC, as an ethnographer down at USC, was doing some work in South Korea and had her researchers go and interview these candlelight protest girls. And one of them said, I'm here because of Dongbang Shinki. Now, Dongbang Shinki is not a political party. Right? Dongbang Shinki is not a protest group. Dongbang Shinki is a boy band. Right? They're like the Jonas Brothers of South Korea. Right? But, there's the cute one and the romantic one, the sporty one. They're boy Spice Girls, basically. I'm dating myself by even knowing who the Spice Girls are. But the point here is that Dongbang Shinki is not a political group. They don't have songs with lyrics about bovine spongiform encephalopathy. They don't have songs with lyrics about trade policy. Right? They do, however, have a bulletin board of 800,000 users. And it was on that bulletin board that those girls radicalized each other. Right? It wasn't that Dongbang Shinki sent this message. It isn't Dongbang Shinki sent me. It's I'm here because of them. Because they provided the convening environment for these girls to have that conversation. Right? And so you can't even tell the story anymore of pop culture and serious culture. Because when pop culture provides the coordinating environment for the serious culture, then the two things are really mixing. Oh yes, and I forgot to show this. Right, here's the Dongbang Shinki bulletin board. This is Cassiopeia, the board where those girls are organized. So convening power, the ability to get a group of people together, not just to consume, but to talk about the things they care about. This is new, right? There's no commercial outlet that covers the Korean music scene. No, not K-pop, not any of the online sites that would say, today we're running a special on US-Korean trade policy. Right? You would not do that if you were running a commercial outfit that was talking about South Korean music. But when the members of Cassiopeia had a bulletin board that let them talk about anything they wanted, and enough of them wanted to talk about the mad cow, the reopening of the market at the same time, it became a site of political radicalization. So we're starting to see not just an increase in amateur participation, but also the ways in which pop culture, which we've typically hived off from serious culture, starting to provide a platform for those two things to come together. Right? That was a story of, the Dongbang Shinki story is a story of short form organization, right? Turn out for a protest. The whole episode lasted about a month. We're also seeing things that are unfolding over longer periods of time, use of the cognitive surplus that are unfolding over longer periods of time. Which brings me to this guy. This is Josh Groban. He's an American singer. He sings a style of music called popra, or sometimes classical crossover, which is about what you'd expect from that description. It's sort of soulful renditions of both Italian opera and American pop classics. And Groban is sweet-voiced, emotionally demonstrative, and cute, which is a pretty winning combination. And his legion of fans was described to me by someone who worked for him as teenage girls and their grandmothers, right? Which makes him a good old internet success story, right? Because there's no mass media that caters to that collection of ages, right? So he could only have gotten his audience online, right? Which is a good story, but that story's been told a lot. What's interesting about Groban is what happened next, right? There was a group of Groban fans who called themselves Grobanites, as one would, who said, on the occasion of his impending 21st birthday, let's get him a birthday present, right? Let's get the fans together, the hardcore fans together. We'll get Josh a birthday present. So here's a man who, before he is legally allowed to drink beer, has fame, fortune, and the adulation of an unending string of teenage fans, right? What are you going to get a guy like that for his birthday, right? So they kick around some ideas. We'll each get him one thing, and he'll get a big pile of whatever that thing is, right? But how many teddy bears does one guy need? So they drop that idea. And they finally say, we're going to make a donation in his name. Right? We're going to pass the hat. We'll make a donation to charity. So the Grobanites get together at one of his concerts, pass the hat, and they raise $1,200. It was pretty good. And then they realize, we don't have any place to donate this because Groban doesn't have a foundation. But his producer does, David Foster, had the David Foster Foundation. So the Grobanites give the money to the David Foster Foundation. They tell Josh for his birthday. The women are delighted. Josh is delighted. Everybody's happy. And they say, let's do that again. Right? That was a nice idea. Let's do that again. So they started a tradition when Josh comes to town and the Grobanites get together before the conference, passing the hat. They raise a few $100, maybe $1,000. And then Julie Clark, one of the Grobanites, says, we raise money when we get together for Josh. But we get together for Josh every day on joshgroban.com, right? Why don't we have an online auction? So they get a piece of crappy auction software because it's 2002 and nothing really works right? So they get some white label auction software and they have to enter every bid by hand, and they get a 19-year-old and this is her first job designing a website, and she does the front end, and the whole rickety thing gets pushed out into cyberspace, and bam, $16,000 in 2 days. They raise more than 10 times more than any previous fundraising effort. And so they suddenly say, now we're really onto something. And they start doing that again and again and again, hosting online auctions, raising money, donating it to David Foster. And after they've thrown off about $75,000 or $80,000 in their first year of online fundraising, they go to Groban and they say, we like the David Foster Foundation and all, but we're not Fosterites. We're Grobanites. We would like for there to be some way for us to donate to you. And so this kind of freaks Groban's lawyers out. Right? Because if you go and read the Chronicle of Philanthropy, which is the sort of house organ for philanthropic efforts, there's not a lot of articles on what you do when a group of people spontaneously self-assembles and starts throwing off tens of thousands of dollars a year for charity. Right? And there are not a lot of those articles because it hasn't really been that big a problem heretofore. So finally they say, yes, we'll start our own 501c3. It's essentially legal money laundering. It's just a way to take this donation and then pass it on to the charities that Groban elects to work with. So this is what the Josh Groban Foundation looks like. It is just an RSS feed on joshgroban.com. There is no independent site. There is no phone number. There is no email address. You cannot contact the Josh Groban Foundation. It's just press releases. It's very clean, very corporate, very minimal. So this is up and running. The women are now able to donate to the Josh Groban Foundation. And after a lot of talking, because everything online always involves lots and lots of talking, they talk for a year and a half about what they should do now, because they've just essentially turned themselves into the volunteer arm of the Josh Groban Foundation. And they decide, no, we don't want that. Right? We want to be our own group. We got this started. Right? Groban exists because of us, not vice versa, the Josh Groban Foundation. So they incorporate as well. Right? They incorporate themselves as the Grobanites for charity. Right? So here's the Josh Groban Foundation, clean, clear, corporate. Grobanites for charity doesn't look like that at all. Grobanites for Charity looks like 1996 threw up, right? You've got these colored tabs. Oh, I seem to have lost the red gun here. You got the hand-drawn bullet point hearts, right? Completely different ways of thinking about here's how you present yourself on the web, right? So why this difference? Why this big split between the clean corporate acceptor of the money and the sort of colorful, amateurish, in every sense of the word, site for the raisers of the money? So one of the big historical ironies, and we'll probably never know if this was coincidence or somehow linked, is that even as people are able to start using online tools to coordinate groups to do stuff like this, the social sciences are increasingly producing explanations for how this stuff works. And they're explanations that are very different from the neoclassical explanations of humans as individually concerned, rational, selfish, self-maximizing actors. So here's an example of some of that research. This is a graph from a paper by two psychologists, Yuri Nisi and Alfredo Rustaccini, on the subject of the culture around money. And what Nisi and Rustaccini set out to do was to test a theory called deterrence theory. Deterrence theory is pretty simple. If you want someone to do less of something, you add a punishment. If you want someone to do more of something, you take a punishment away. Right? Simple, straightforward, also largely untested. So they said, we're going to test this. So they go and they observe 10 daycare centers in Haifa, Israel. And they observe those daycare centers at the moment of highest tension, which is pickup time. At pickup time, the teachers have been with your kids all day, and they would like them returned to your care at the appointed hour. Meanwhile, the parents, the caregivers, may be busy at work, running an errand, whatever, would like a little slack to be late. So Nisi and Rustaccini said, how often are parents late at these 10 daycare centers? And the answer is, these two lines represent two groups of the daycare centers. They're late between 6 and 10 times a week, 6 and 11 times a week. So they divided the daycare centers into two groups. The white squares are the control group, the black diamonds are the experimental group. And in the daycare centers in the experimental group, they said, we are changing this behavior as of right now. Right? If you pick your kid up late at one of the experimental daycare centers, if you're there more than 10 minutes late, bamma, 10 shekel fine added to your bill, no ifs, ands, or buts. Right? The minute they implemented that fine, the behavior at those daycare centers changed. They went up every week for the next 4 weeks, topping out at triple the pre-fine average, and then fluctuating it between double and triple the pre-fine average for the rest of the time. Right? You could see immediately what happened. Right? The fine broke the previous culture. Right? By adding a fine, they managed to communicate to the parents that once you've paid your 10 shekels, you've discharged your entire duty to the school, and you need not have any social concern or residue of guilt for the teachers. To which the parents quite reasonably said, 10 shekels to pick my kid up late. What could be bad? Right? So they run this experiment for 12 weeks. And then they say, OK, that was very interesting. Thank you very much. They cancel the fine. And then something really funny happens. Nothing changes. Not only did money break the previous culture, but once it got broken, it stayed broken even after the thing that broke it was removed. This is, in both cases, the opposite of what deterrence theory would predict. So under the terms of the neoclassical view of human behavior, where we're all rational, self-maximizing actors, what that theory would have us believe about these daycare centers is that in the absence of any kind of contract or fine, there were simply no constraints on parental behavior around late pickup times. But what Nisi and Rustaccini showed is, in fact, there were cultural constraints. Prior to the financial constraints, there were cultural constraints. And as we can see from the control group, the cultural constraints actually create a more generous bargain than the contractual constraints. So, back to Josh Groban. The page that I showed you earlier, is the thank you page. It starts, we want to thank you, Josh, obviously, as one would start. It goes down and starts naming everybody who's part of Josh Groban Foundation, Grobanites for Charity. And it goes on in this vein for 350 names. Right? 350 people thanked by name, because gratitude is the coin of the realm on this side of the split. Right? You've got one charity divided into two halves, the Grobanites for Charity, who raise the money, and 100% of the donated funds go to charity because they raise the administrative funds off on the side. And then you've got the Grobanite Foundation, which accepts the money and disperses it to the charities they have selected. And what they've done, in a way, is the same split from the Nisi and Rustaccini experiment in Haifa, which is they've said there's a commercial aspect to this, and that's going to be run as a business, the way the school is. But also, there's an aspect of mutual respect and understanding and motivation. And we're actually going to go out of our way and spend extra energy to keep that away from the money part. The reason these organizations were founded in two halves was to separate this half, was to separate the Grobanites from charity from the part that had to run itself like a business. Right? So what we see in examples like this are places where our intrinsic motivations, our motivations to do things because we like to do them, right, are starting to ramify on a large public level. Right? We're used to the idea that our personal motivations, the stuff we do because we like it, has only private ramifications. It's friends and family. It's people nearby. But that everything out in the public stage is extrinsically motivated. Right? What digital technology gives us is an environment in which personal motivations can have public consequences. That a group of people doing things literally out of the goodness of their hearts because they love what they're doing and they love each other in the context of what they're doing can actually form a charity, right? And sometime this year, these guys will have raised their millionth dollar, right? Not bad for a bunch of amateurs, right? That's the kind of change. That's the kind of change that's possible now. So one of the striking things about taking advantage of the cognitive surplus in this way, taking advantage of cumulative free time and talents, is the possibility not just of doing old things in a new way, but of actually doing new things, of rethinking some fairly fundamental problems and coming to new answers, which is to say, not just treating the technology as a tool, but treating it as something that we need new kinds of cultural norms around to use. So here's an example. This is one of the most audacious experiments I know of for taking digital tools and working with them both as a way of aggregating information down at the low level, but also thinking about the cultural norms that have to form around them at the high level. This is a screenshot from Patients Like Me. It is a website that aggregates sufferers, typically of chronic diseases, often of rare chronic diseases. They're probably their most important community right now are sufferers of Lou Gehrig's disease. And these patients share an unbelievable amount of information about themselves. So here's a 23-year-old female living in Scotland who is manic depressive and charts her mood every day. Right? She puts on both, short-term episodes of good and bad mood, moving averages of mood. Right? There are people who get together and pool not just their medications, but their dosages, so that you can start to see what the range of medical dosages are that doctors are prescribing. Right? And the goal of Patients Like Me is to change medical research by aggregating so much data that finding experimental patients for chronic diseases and studying them is made orders of magnitude easier. Right? The largest panel of sufferers of two particular subcategories of Lou Gehrig's disease. The largest panel of patients studied for those diseases, 17 people. Tiny, tiny numbers to test a new drug. Patients Like Me gets 1 in 10 new diagnoses. They have thousands of Lou Gehrig's disease sufferers on the set, including hundreds from the rarer variants. So they have dramatically changed the ability of the research community to get to the information they need, and they hope to accelerate the design and experimentation with possible new drugs and treatments. But here's the thing. Oh, yes, sir.
So, do you want? Is it okay?
Sure.
So, any self-reported data, how do you check the validity of it? How do you, there are a whole lot of dimensions along with people may not want to report either in full or report.
Yeah. Okay. So there's a couple of answers to that, which is one, you learn what the range is, and then you look for outliers, or you get a large enough data that the noise filters out. But to your second point, which is self-reported data is difficult to rely on in a medical context, this is the dramatic thing that they're doing. They're not just casually aggregating medical data, because even though this person is not identified by name, I think we all know enough about data matching to know that if I went through this profile, I could make a good stab at figuring out who this is, right? And there are some profiles where it's rare enough in terms of age, gender, city combinations plus disease that you could make a good stab at finding that person without a lot of work. And yet here they are sharing their data. So what Patients Like Me recognizes is exactly what you said, which is that there is a bias against certain classes of self-reporting data. And they're not just saying, well, that's a problem. They're saying, we are out to change that. So in addition to data aggregation, They do this. Every site, as you would expect, that handles medical data is required to have a privacy policy, and Patients Like Me does. But always, on every page, the link next to their privacy policy is their openness philosophy. And their openness philosophy says, notwithstanding the entirety of medical culture in the Western world, we want you to share. Right? We want you to actively not just resist, but reject sharing. And we want you to tell people more about your symptoms than is normal now. So this is what makes it audacious, to your question, which is they're trying to solve the concern about reporting problem at the source by actually changing the cultural norms around the willingness to give accurate data. Now, it doesn't change the internal reports of mood, may be somewhat suspect, but if it works, it will change the willingness to actually tell people what's going on. There's an analogy in the early history of print to the shift from alchemy to chemistry. The alchemists, the chemists all had the same equipment. They all had the same braziers and vials and so forth. The big difference was that the chemists said, we're going to publish our results, and we're not going to believe anything unless someone else has done the experiment at the same time. So the change from alchemy to chemistry was actually not a technical change, but a cultural change around the idea of evidence and proof and documentation. And what Patients Like Me is trying to do is a similar thing around the culture of healthcare. So this brings me back to the lolcats. You can imagine a kind of a spectrum for uses of this surplus free time, sort of collaborative uses of this surplus free time. Running from lolcats up to something like Ushahidi, or Patients Like Me, or pick your large-scale public effort. And both of these are good, right? I like lolcats as much as the next guy. In fact, probably more. But I have a hard time looking into the future and envisioning an internet where someone is saying to themselves, where, oh where, can I find a picture of a cute cat? Right? That seems to me to be a largely solved problem. That our ability to crack each other up with relatively throwaway efforts is essentially communal value. Right? It's value created by the participants for each other. And so if it's photos on Flickr, videos on YouTube, models on one of the Lego building sites, whatever it is, there's lots and lots and lots of sources of communal value for almost any interest you could have. What Ushahidi is doing, that was interesting. Yes, what Ushahidi is doing, what Patients Like Me is doing, is trying to create civic value. Right? They're trying to create value that is created by the participants but enjoyed by society as a whole. So if Patients Like Me manages to make certain patients feel better because they can compare notes and feel like somebody else shares their suffering, that will be a good thing in those patients, but Patients Like Me as a goal will have failed because they want to do nothing less than transform American medical culture. Ditto Ushahidi. They want to do nothing less than transform what civilians know in a time of crisis, which is fraught with all kinds of questions about how the government feels about that. And this is, I think, and this is how the book ends, and this is how I will end here. This is, I think, the great open question. Not whether we're going to get lots and lots of communal value. We have lots and lots of communal value already. That, unless Comcast manages to get hold of every last wire, that is going to continue, right? The open question is this, right? How much civic value are we going to get out of this medium? Right? Dean Kamen, the inventor and entrepreneur, has said, free cultures get what they celebrate. Right? And the question, I think, for us now is, how much are we going to be able to celebrate and reward and contribute to the civic part of this culture? Because that's going to determine, I think, to a large degree, how much value we get out of the cognitive surplus. Thank you very much. I'll end there. Thank you, Kim. Thanks very much. And time for some questions if anybody has any. Yes, sir.
Have you spent any time sort of grafting your ideas onto the ideas that Jeremy Rifkin's kind of put out there in Empathic Civilization, his recent?
I am I am interested in that. I don't know where the overlap point is yet, because so the question about empathic civilization is so much a question of who we see as having a shared fate with us. So the places where right now you can see the kind of civic uses of cognitive surplus most readily are in a way places where that question has already been solved, right? The Grobanites had something that they shared already, and then they attacked the new problem. The Dongbangxinqi kids, even the Mangalore women. What I don't know, what I hope for but haven't done the grafting as you say, is that we can expand the radius of our loyalty. The way Richard Rorty described justice, which is justice as larger loyalty. As a private citizen, I hope for a world in which we can have a more empathic sense of who we're sharing these things with. But I don't know, as someone talking about this stuff in public, I don't know what levers would be required yet. So that's a long way of saying no. Which is to say, I don't know where those two things mesh, but what I do know is the places where we can see this most clearly are the places where the problems that Rifkin is after have already been solved, and I don't know what it will take to get us to increase our sense of who we've got the shared empathy with. I'm sorry, go ahead. But you had a follow-on, yes?
Yeah, I did. So, suggestion. That there may be there may be a way to look at this that talks about it in terms of the expanding sense of self, and that actually grabs in Daniel Siegel and Mindsight and mirror neurons and that book. I guess the other thing I would say is, are we already witnessing that that expansion of the sense of one the sense of self, and two the sense of connectedness with others by virtue of our facility that we now have to communicate with each other and understanding that the fates of others that we thought were so disparate in years past isn't just because it isn't. You communicate within one world.
It's quite clear. I mean, one of the interesting things that's going on right now with the BP oil crisis ramifying in the UK and the Greek meltdown ramifying in the EU and worldwide and so forth is that our awareness of the interconnectedness of these kinds of problems, whether they're financial or environmental or whatever, is growing. I don't think that that's happening just because, which is to say, I don't think that any communications technology, I don't think any communications technology can make people behave better towards one another on its own. The telegraph was predicted it was going to end war, usher in an age of world peace. Instead, it turned out to be the driving force of the Crimean War, which is the first modern conflict, in part because of the telegraph. So, I don't think we get a free ticket to world peace because of the communications technology, and that's sort of what I mean. I don't know what the cultural drivers are to get that expanded sense of self. We're certainly seeing it in some communities, but I don't believe that it is technologically determined that will spread worldwide. But it is also, I should say, a very interesting idea, and I'll go back and take a look at that because I hadn't thought to join those two things up. So thank you for that intuition. Yes.
Do you think there's a problem with the secret handshake type aspect of your examples where you have to come in as a fan already of X, right? And then you, as a group, somehow extrapolate that togetherness in order to solve problem Y. And so as an outsider, I might be interested in problem Y, but the fact that it was started by people who were fans of X, it's, I'm sorry, it kind of, tarnishes their rep a little bit because I don't see how I could belong to that group.
Right. Well, so this is the great dilemma of collective action problems in general, which is without some coordinating influence, it's very difficult to get a group of people to do anything together. There are other examples where there are much lower thresholds to participation, or where the participation and the interest are the same. Although I didn't write about it in the book, have spent a lot of time in the last couple of years looking at the adult fans of Lego communities, mock pages, and so forth. And there, all you have to do is be interested in Legos, and you're automatically one of the party, right? And so that's a place where it's not a secret handshake in a way, because it's a public handshake. If you're interested, you're here. If you're not interested, you're not here. I can't think of any examples where a serious collective action problem has been solved where there wasn't some commonality to the participants. I mean, even the Nisha Susan example, right? Those women weren't coordinated previously by pop culture, unlike the South Korean girls or the Josh Groban fans. But there was still clearly some shared sense of urgency around Sri Ram Sena. And I'm tempted to say that that's just the human condition, which is to say the idea of forming a large, committed group of people who have nothing in common other than a shared interest in a particular problem is almost always going to go to market-like solutions rather than to socially coordinated solutions, because we're just not that good at coordinating socially with people that we don't have some shared sense of contact with. So I don't think that there are going to come, put it another way, I think if I were to start an auction tomorrow for a generic buy the things on this site and I'm going to give the money to causes that go to kids, I don't think I would do as well as the Grobanites. I think the advanced form of the coordination matters a lot less than we thought it did, as with a boy band becoming political activists. But I don't think, I can't right now think of any examples that gets out from under that problem. So I guess I'd hypothesize that some coordinating tool or some shared sense of membership, whether that's experienced as a secret handshake or not, is a precursor to almost all of this stuff, because it's just that's the thing that gets the group synchronized enough to imagine doing something together in the first place. To make a historical analogy, the reason our current constitution is the one that we got in the 1780s instead of the 1770s is the states had to have enough of a shared sense of outcome before they were willing to tear up the old model and write the new model. And it's seeing patterns like that play out over hundreds of years that makes me think that that's not an easy problem. There's a question over here, but yes, sir.
Yeah, so you almost seem to be championing these instances of civic, and I don't know if that's your great hope in part of the book. And what I'm wondering is whether or not there are groups already trying to create awareness of this revolution that's occurring, and then to maybe improve upon each other's technologies, to be able to spread this to a greater sense. I mean, it's one thing to just let it populate itself out, but it's another thing to try and take it to that next level.
No, absolutely. And I am certainly championing it. This is not a book of descriptive, here comes everybody. The previous book was basically descriptive, right? Here's how we got where we are with social media. This book ends particularly with his observation around the rise of chemistry, that it is the social norms around these tools that make the big difference. What we're used to from print culture, almost all the important parts of print culture aren't functions of, don't come from dealing with books, but rather from dealing with the problems books caused. Right? So once we got abundance, then we had to have academic disciplines, right? We had to separate fiction from nonfiction and so forth. And so it's the response to the new irritants in the environment. And I think in this case, right, the abundance of the web plainly, transforming all kinds of business and organizational logic, the value we're going to get out of that as a society is going to be around the civic stuff.
Who's going to challenge us to get to the Nobel Prize, right? And I mean,
yeah.
Motivator there for all obvious reasons, but who's going to get us to that awareness and reward and bring it to that next stage of awareness?
So I don't know. I go back and forth between thinking attention to this is a basic possibility, right? The addressability in aggregate of our free time and talents is something people should be aware of. And yet, every specific example I see, they weren't thinking about the substrate. They're like, oh yeah, we'll just use this tool because we've got this other thing we want to get to do. And what I can't tell is, are those special cases eventually going to turn into something where we understand the whole thing? Or is it going to be like, again, to harken back to the printing press, the scientists have, their periodic journals and the English department has novels, and they both love the printing press, but if you got them together, I'm not sure they'd agree about what it's good for. So I don't think, put another way, I don't think the South Korean kids and the patients like me, sufferers, would actually have that profitable conversation about the substrate. So I think it is probably up to the techies to make tools that are both flexible enough and functional enough to make them pressable into service in the environments they're needed. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm wondering if you differentiate in your book, kind of tying in Daniel Siegel and or David Siegel, right? Kind of similar vein with what Daniel Pink has been exploring with Drive, the story
yes.
about what motivates us. And I'm wondering if you make the distinction between the social media technology that really is the medium for what I think I see in all of your examples about being purpose-driven. And he
yes.
really drives that basically businesses and schools, especially in the US and Europe, have got to get rid of the if-then, your school example of the if-then fear model.
Right.
And move to an intrinsic motivation model, right? They were all motivated, right? They used the technology, but really they were intrinsically motivated around a purpose.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So Pink and I did a conversation in last month's Wired, and he cleaned up the transcript quite nicely and made us both sound like not idiots. But in fact, we were completing each other's sentences because we had both been looking at the same stuff. We both quote Deci, we both quote Nisi and Rustichini. The formulation I use in the book is this: behavior is motivation filtered through opportunity. And we have had this long period where there's new technology and we see new behaviors, and therefore the technology caused the behavior, right? Correlation. And that's that, once you implement email, it flattens hierarchies, right? We're told these things. And I believe that, right? I'm making fun of it because, for the first 10 years or so that I was doing this, I was in this kind of techno-determinist model. And what I've seen and what Pink has seen is that technology is only an opportunity. And it is the motivations filtered through those opportunities that make the behaviors. And we now have a medium where the motivations that matter most are the intrinsic ones. And I concentrate in particular on 4 in the book: the desire to feel autonomous, to feel competent, to feel a sense of membership, and to feel a sense of generosity. So 2 personal and 2 social that, to me, I'm not proposing that that's a complete taxonomy, but they largely cover the cases that I'm interested in. And I think that ability to have a group that is intentionally minded and intrinsically motivated and now has the tools to harness that into public action, that's the big deal.
But I think the autonomy, the main tie that I heard between the two of you is the autonomy piece, because his is around purpose, mastery, and autonomy.
Right.
And when you look at our schools and our companies, especially our review models, it's totally in conflict.
Right.
So I wonder where that sea change will happen, maybe through the technology, but that sea change of the generational, pool of having to be much more purpose-driven and autonomy-driven.
So I think the place in our interpretations where Pink and I differ, not because we disagree, but because we have different lenses. My lens has always been social. I've always been most interested in what happens to group life. So the education stories that I tell in the book have to do with, like Chris Avenue, that kid who nearly got kicked out of college for starting a Facebook study group, right? So we all know that learning is social. We all remember study groups from college, but once this kid goes and does it online and people can see him, he's suddenly almost expelled. So although obviously the question of motivated and autonomous learners is important because it's not a social question. It's not the one I take on here. The piece I'm most interested in is we've always treated learning as a social enterprise, and we've always denied that at the moment we hand out diplomas. And so we now have this medium where the social piece is high leverage and high visibility, and suddenly the tension between those two things, which was manageable as long as it was subterranean, is now out in the open. Yes, ma'am.
So these are very powerful mediums, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on when they get hijacked by marketeers. For example, patients like me, somebody from a pharmaceutical company sends all their employees to say, I used so-and-so and now I feel so much better. Or, that's just one example. Or a political lobbyist going on some political society for it.
Yeah. So one of the big concerns around this kind of hijacking has been what Nicholas Carr calls the digital sharecropping problem, right? Why are all the people uploading videos on YouTube raising Google share price? Why are all the people uploading photos in Flickr raising Yahoo share price or whatever? And that problem seems to me to be largely overblown, in part because we're perfectly content to have our kids assemble Legos at home. We don't think a Lego is making them do the labor that they should be doing in the factory, right? The kids are assembling the toys because it's fun. But there are cases where the digital sharecropping problem does appear, like the AOL lawsuit where the guides at AOL sued AOL for treating them like unpaid employees. So in the book, I raise the idea that people are sensitive enough to that kind of misuse that transparency essentially becomes the key factor. What I didn't know, and what I would write differently if I was publishing it in the fall instead of in the spring, is what we've seen around Facebook recently with the privacy policy, which is it possible for there to be an entity that is so large and so important that even if you are unhappy, there is no alternative, right? That the network effects of belonging to, in this case, Facebook, are so overpowering that the ability for individuals to switch services if they don't like the terms of service in one place or another place, as happened to AOL, goes away. I don't know the answer to that question, but even worse for me, it wasn't a question I asked in the book because I hadn't understood that Facebook was going to continue to drive in the direction of resetting the defaults continually away from current social norms around privacy. So that is at the very least the thing that worries me most right now, is that someone could escape the negative judgment of their own users by simply becoming a utility rather than a service. And obviously, of all the companies we're looking at right now, Facebook is in the absolutely closest, is absolutely in the high watermark of that condition. I'm not sure. I don't know what will happen. I'm not a careful enough Kremlinologist of Facebook. It's become one of those companies that you almost have to watch full time for to read the tea leaves. So I don't know what's going to happen there. But that is a worry that I didn't have when I was writing the book, and now I wish I'd had all along. Betsy.
Yeah, I'm going to ask, and you know my bias in this because of where I work, but what are your thoughts about Google Buzz? Because when you said Facebook is the first in line for this kind of consideration, like too big to fail, too big to ignore, or whatever. Like, if you have a profile system on any one carrier, I mean, it could be a telephone carrier, it could be Google, it could be somewhere else. Do you see that coming into play with? So is the question: is Google Buzz disciplining Facebook, or does Google Buzz represent the same kind of threat as Facebook, or both? Both. People were sort of looking, they're like, oh, well, only Google can take on Facebook now, and it was just interesting.
This will seem like pandering in this room, but I actually have been absolutely consistently public on this opinion from the middle of the decade on. Google does not get social, right? And I know this as an advisor to a social software company that got bought by Google and then crushed from inattention. They never understood the way nulls were different than Wikipedia. They never understood that force activating someone's social network didn't seem like a great acceleration of what I was going to do anyway. It just seemed weird. Dana Boyd consistently has the best lines, but she said apropos the Facebook privacy debate, but I think it applies equally well to Google's flipping on the network. This isn't a question of liberals versus libertarians. This is a question of robots versus monkeys. And the robot point of view says, oh, it's just data, right? So we're just going to activate the data because that's what robots do. We want more data. And monkeys, like us, are really, really worried about which data goes to whom under what circumstances. And so when the robots get control, they do things like, hey, we just lit up your whole social network so everybody can see who you talk to all the time. How about that? Big time saver. And they happen to do it in a way that illustrated it right as the Tehrani protests after the June election of last year were in their horrible end phase, where people were being rounded up, and Tehran had shut down access to Google 2 days before. And ironically, if they'd left it up, they would suddenly have had instant visibility into the dissident networks that use Gmail, because Google would have provided it to them on a silver plate. But just through a historical accident, they'd shut the service off 48 hours before Google did this boneheaded thing. So the thing that worries me about Facebook is that they're competent. And I don't have that worry about Google vis-a-vis social stuff right now. That may change, but no, seriously. They've not executed well.
Advertising company.
Well, I think it is less simple than that, which is to say, even before they were an advertising company, they were an algorithm company. Which is to say, even before they had a business model, they were. Go ahead.
But their business was not creating the algorithms. Their business is selling ads. Their algorithms service their business model.
You know what? But the algorithms.
Algorithm business. They're not ad business.
No, I understand that. But what I'm saying is they're in the ad business, but they're in the algorithm culture. Even their ad business is algorithm driven, which is to say, the work came out of algorithmic work, and it came away from kind of abstracting away human, the monkey part of the equation, and just leaving the nice robotic PageRank algorithm underneath. So I don't think that Buzz exhibits a similar threat. Unfortunately, for that same reason, I also don't think it represents much of an escape valve either. When I look at the Friendster to MySpace to Facebook trade-offs, there were critical early mistakes at Friendster at exactly the moment MySpace appeared to take up the slack. There were chronic, not catastrophic, but persistent mistakes at Facebook, which meant at a time when they could have been neck and neck, they just went at a slow decline, from which it's pretty clear they're not going to recover. It's MySpace, sorry. I'm not sure that cycle plays itself out again, which is to say there's always been a leading social network. Facebook, there was a period there where it looked like country by country, this one's Bebo and that one's Orkut and so forth. Even that's going away, right? They have, depending on how you measure it, someplace between a third and a quarter of the web, at least, they've seen them once, long enough to make a profile. So I'm not sure that there's enough of a market for an alternative to discipline them. And the Orwellianly named open social work suggests that they know exactly what they have in the network effect. So I don't, you shudder to think about government intervention for something like that, but also, right, if this becomes enough of a problem, it will probably be Germany that does it, right, the country with the most aggressive privacy laws. But my guess is that sometime in the next 2 or 3 years, we're going to see Germany versus Facebook in an EU court somewhere. Yes, sir.
It seems like that this kind of crowdsourcing works well for fairly simple problems which you can understand very easily. But for example, things like shift space, right, which in effect is a fascinating problem that they're trying to solve, it doesn't get traction, right, because it's not very easy to understand the motivation or even understand these things. And the same with the Facebook compete efforts that are on now in the open source community. Yeah. Right? How do you guide these things? I keep forgetting the name of the Facebook company.
Diaspora.
Yeah. So how do you actually guide these things along?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So shift space is two former students of mine, Mushan Zeraviv and Dan Pfeiffer, who have done an annotation layer for the web. And Third Voice has done this. Several people have done this. But what they did is they said, we're going down. We're going to try this again because it's got more open standards. So they went with, they're a Grease Monkey plugin. And they're now rewriting it in HTML5 because finally there are standards that mean you can do it natively in the browser, as it has always wanted to be. But the problem with all of those things, and this gets back to the question about the secret handshake, is it seems like when you launch a new tool, you want to make it available to everybody all at once. But the minute you do that, the likelihood that any two people who use the tool will have anything to say to one another is functionally 1 over the size of your population. So the only places shift space has gotten any traction right now are groups of artists or annotators who are already having a conversation with one another and who want to adopt this tool, or groups of activists whose normative views about what was needed were so in line right? But they had to inherit the relationships. This is the problem, one of several problems, frankly, with diaspora, which is also out of NYU, although not my students. These are CS students. Diaspora is unfortunately, it was a press release that caught the full wind of the Facebook privacy concerns. I don't know. There was a period there where whenever anything happened with a social network, Mark Cantor would post something 10 minutes later saying, what this really wants to be is an open standard, right? It's like he had the post ready and he just put the name of the technology in immediately afterwards. And it never worked because the open source effort always started with a deficit, in this case a deficit of 500 million users. And it started with no more than a sense that open is better than closed, which, even if you buy that as a generic proposition, doesn't tell you much about the technology. So at the very least, the risk of the diaspora project is that it is people viewed it as so important so soon. They set up a Kickstarter campaign to raise 10 grand, and they raised 100 and change. And in fact, I think Kickstarter should not let people raise 10x what they need, because it will distort, same as if the VC gives you 10 times what you need. But I think the risk with the diaspora project is essentially that people are now expecting nothing less than salvation. And when the 0.1 version ships, it will look like an 0.1 version. And the world will look at that and pass on. So they've gone quiet, which I think is exactly what they should be doing. And they probably shouldn't pop up again until they're at 0.5 or what have you. But the larger problem, which is the width versus depth trade-off for this stuff, is the opposite of the width versus depth trade-off we're used to from the kind of casually funded VC world. The goal is not maximize the number of individual users in the shortest amount of time, but rather maximize for network density and only grow as quickly as you can keep the kind of density that makes the services feel good. Because to the point about intrinsic motivation, if you don't feel good, the service stops working. Which is why, I think back to your question, these things have tended to start around places where the good feeling and social density has already been there and the other things can be built. If we had a generic way to take a group of people and fuse them, in the way that sometimes accidents do, we see communities spontaneously forming in times of accidents or disaster, because suddenly there is a big shared task salient to everybody, even though they have nothing else in common. If there was some way to manufacture that, we might make some traction. But I think the general problem remains as it was, which is you kind of have to start with groups that have some shared sensibility already. Yes, sir.
Hasn't Twitter's model been doing that?
Twitter's model been doing, growing with network density. Yes, absolutely. So Twitter started as a small, tremendously clustered social graph. And boy, there's nothing for clustering social graph like launching at South by Southwest, right? I mean, everybody who's tweeting is 6 feet away from everybody else who's tweeting. And so it had immediately that kind of real world feeling. And if you look at the growth of the Twitter graph, it has always been connected to the 85th percentile, which is to say the number of singletons or sort of small and otherwise unconnected clusters is completely minor compared to the densely connected whole. And that did very well for them because they grew, at that, it's the thing that makes the logistic curve work the way it does. They grew at that kind of gradual rate. And then suddenly the next time anybody checked in, they'd gone into the sort of exponential part of the growth curve where, as far as I know, they still are today. But to the point about social density, they've always worked in that way, which is to say, people tend to be connected to the service by being connected to each other first, and are therefore, part of the social graph in the beginning.
Maybe one more question.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Oh yes, ma'am.
Regarding the participants on the web in general, these tools. You've got the voyeurs who do nothing and watch everybody else, right? And then you have the commenters, like, oh, that was cute, but it's not really a contribution.
Right.
And then there's people who are really out there contributing, right? And that's a pyramid right now, right? Do you see that squaring off or flipping?
I don't see it squaring off or flipping for any given service, which is to say it seems unlikely to me that Wikipedia, say, will ever have 5% of the contributors all operating flat out, right? There's always going to be a power law distribution. The big open question is, are people who are lurking here going to be participating there? Which is to say, looked at, I think services will always be a triangle. Will there be so many triangles effectively that everybody has some environment where they participate a lot and another environment where they participate a little, right? So I comment on, not Three Quarks Daily, Crooked Timber, a sociology weblog. I just read Sadie Doyle. I just read Tiger Beatdown. There are people, I'm sure, who read Tiger Beatdown. I read and comment on Tiger Beatdown and only, only read Crooked Timber. We don't yet have enough data to know whether or not that everybody participates somewhere model is going to become widespread. Put another way, what we don't yet know is whether or not the high participators now are a vanguard or an elite. Right? If they're a vanguard, they're like the people using email in 1991. Right? Everybody laughed at us, like, oh, well, it's so geeky and dorky. Or actually, they didn't even know what it was. Geeky and dorky came about 95. And then, 5 years later, it's like, yeah, okay, everybody's using it. It's gotten normal.
Statistical sampling of what people are doing right now is less interesting than where is it going and
Yes.
how to get them
Yes,
there.
right.
And actually, that's a question that's related to your studies, which is that what you're saying is that it actually was initially some other social commonality that got people in. And
Right.
is there any other theory other than social commonality to get people from the voyeurs to the contributors group?
Well, so there are a bunch of things which go for audience effects rather than for socially connected effects. So, lolcats, right? So I can see a lolcat and think, okay, I have some sans serif fonts and a picture of a cat. Like, I can play this game too. And I make a lolcat and upload it. I don't need to know other people who are doing lolcats to plug into that network. On the other hand, the feedback from that is not as socially significant either. So I can get a bit of the rush of, it's a different way. I can get a bit of the rush of, say, doing karaoke, right? Although that's actually generally done with a group of friends. So that's forget that metaphor. That's a bad metaphor. But the pleasure of public performance is one of the places where people can be invited to participate without needing that social connectivity. On the other hand, the attendant output also tends to be fairly disaggregated, right? Which is to say, it's just a collection of pictures at the end of the day, or YouTube is just a collection of images or whatever. Now, for problems that are parallelizable enough that that's all you want is accumulations of bits of participation, using those kind of motivations is a good way to get people to do it. Is a good way to get people to participate. But the kind of participation that requires cooperation, almost by definition, I think, requires some sense of who the other participants are. And how that gets forged, again, it's different for different projects, but doing the forging of the social connection is, I think, a critical part of getting most of this stuff to work. So thank you all. Thank you for coming out. Thank you, Kim, for organizing this. Thank you, Lily.
I'm going to be signing books for everyone over here, and you can have additional questions for a bit anyway.